Greetings, friends, and welcome to this show this afternoon here in Pennsylvania, and I guess this afternoon in Texas too.
That's true.
Frank, my guest is Frank Dietz, correct? It's Dietz, right, Frank?
Yes.
And I ran into Frank's, Frank responded to me to email that I sent out, or I'm not sure how we connected, but it was over Walter Brueggemann's biography, and so, Frank, why don't you just welcome to the show? Why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about who you are, what you've been up to, and then what your connection to Walter is, to Eden and the evangelical German pietist tradition.
Sure. I'm Frank Dietz. I'm married to Karen Pottermeal. I am a native of New Orleans and grew up in one of the very vital in my growing up years in the 40s and 50s German evangelical or ENR churches of the United Church of Christ, and experienced the UCC wedding in my last years in New Orleans before taking off to Elmhurst College and Eden Seminary, etc. The adventure has been considerable. I thought after Elmhurst that I would break the Elmhurst Eden eternity tradition because I was interested across the waterfront in a lot of stuff. And I ruled out CTS in Chicago because it had become so preoccupied with what I at the time thought of as sort of specialized ministries. I almost accepted either coast, Pacific School of Religion and Yale Divinity School. And then I came back to some conversations I had with people about what I wanted out of seminary education. And I think the admissions people were saying, you can be very scholarly. And I was thinking that I had come out of a pretty politically involved milieu in New Orleans of dissenting people who were dissenting mostly about civil rights and race relations in our neighborhood. I really wanted to be a pastor. And my siblings were not so happy about that because they thought that the institution ought to be just junked. Ironically, they are closer to it now than I am. But they were, what can you accomplish if you're trapped by these narrow-minded people that I began to say seem to be operating with a kind of early Sunday school fundamentalist tradition and not very open to the rest of the community. And that became a big theme, I guess, for me. Then in the course of my ordained ministry, I was always very involved in the community and in ecumenical and interfaith stuff. And in Houston, I had become the president of Houston Metropolitan Ministries at the time. And several judicatory people had lunch with me one day and said, we'd like for you to think about being director of the Texas Conference of Churches and working ecumenically. And I said, well, that's sort of off track from who I am and what I've been about. And my family was away. And so I said, well, and so then one of them called me and said, we have to have your profile by Wednesday of next week, because that's when we're going to have a meeting. And we'd really like you in the mix. And I said, well, okay, go ahead. And the short story of that is they responded and I responded to this. And every time I was asked, how did you prepare? And several people said, did you go to Yale and prepare for ecumenical ministry? And I said, actually, no. But I said, it just seems to come very naturally. It's what my journey is about. And that has to do with resonating with some of what you've um, found in your roamings around in some of the earlier stuff of the pietistic and scholarly, but always with an ecumenical and a justice set of themes.
The wandering around is good language, Frank. It has been a kind of wandering around since I first unearthed this Walter Brueggemann's biography, or began working on it 2 years ago, or 2 years ago. And even just before we talked, I got an email from two people saying, "I'm a student of Walter's early in the years. Would you, I'd be open to being interviewed." And it's just been this kind of movement coming out of the woodwork, as it is, would be, of folks who have responded. Why do you think there's been this kind of energy, interest in going back 40, 50 years, both to Walter Brueggemann, to Eden Seminary, but also to the tradition? What has been dormant that is that awakens again when it smells itself, when it smells pietism, Irenic ecumenism, and so on?
Well, I suspect others in their own journeys have experienced some of what I did when people would say, "Oh, I can't believe you're a graduate of Eden Seminary. I thought," and they would tell me where they thought I had gone. And I said, "Well, I think you would be surprised in terms of the opportunities for study and some of the rigors." And that just continued through. I think also in more recent years, there's a kind of, in the UCC that I have loved dearly, been more of a disparagement, and it's happened to us in our local church here in New Braunfels, Texas, a disparagement of any of us that are thought of as heritage people or part of that tradition, which has been regarded as reluctant to be along. And I've challenged that frequently in some interesting places, because my experience and what I know of the earlier church stuff in the old evangelical tradition and in our church was that there was a strong congruence with the social justice activism of the Congregational Church. And so it was a more natural coming together than some people have felt. And yet, that has continued. And I have been particularly, I guess, resentful at times of sort of being put in a box, sort of like, "Oh, you grew up in New Orleans, so you must hate Black people."
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Oh, you ought to know my family story."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've gotten some of those emails, some irate emails from folks in the UCC tradition who said, "We don't need any more holding up this tradition. It's time to put it finally to bed." And there's been, this is all new territory for me, Frank. This tension within this tradition, within the UCC, over this tradition and its heritage. Let's go back to Eden Seminary. You show up at Eden. What did you experience as a student? There was a major league of faculty there at the time, great faculty. Walt Brueggemann was there. What did you experience with Walt, but others as well? What were your Eden days like, Frank? What do you value about those days?
A part of my curiosity in making my final decision to go to Eden was that several people, as I was a senior at Elmhurst, said, "Oh, there's this lively new guy, and he's going to be your Old Testament professor, along with another very interesting person, Lee Whiston. And they're not alike, so you're going to learn a lot." And I got there in his second year, and I remember telling him one time, I'm sure he doesn't remember this, "I don't think you need to try to cram into us in one one set of Old Testament basic introductory studies, your 8 years, because the energy and the passion that he had was that that's what we had to do. And I was a little more up to the task of that than some of my classmates who had not come through a denominational school where I had had Greek. And so it was just Hebrew that I was going to take. But religion courses and so forth. I was a little more prepared than some were for that, who had come out of engineering and business degrees. And so I became kind of a tutor of sorts for people who were really having trouble with some of the demands for pretty rigorous writing and the like. And then I remember thinking more than once, 2 or 3 times in the course of my being connected to Eden, they're trying to be the German university that they are not. And they ought to be the divinity school, maybe at Washington University or ecumenically at St. Louis University. And some of the faculty would settle down a little bit about some of their demands. But it was great. And I was surprised that I did not see his mentor, Alan Worley, in what has been written, or that didn't jump out at me, because a number of people said to me that Alan Worley had the charisma and the storytelling ability that Walt inherited.
Oh.
And I thought that was interesting. And they contrasted Eugene Worley, who had been my religion professor at Elmhurst, but had become the New Testament professor at Eden when I got there. Gene was a very quiet, understated, much shyer person. And his dad apparently was all over the place. Well, that's a good description of Walter Brueggemann.
Yeah.
In many ways.
So father and son were at Eden and Elmhurst, the Worleys.
I don't. Alan Worley was at Eden.
Eden.
Had retired.
Right.
Gene Worley went from Eden as a student, I think, to Chicago Divinity School, okay. And he was what's the name? Goodspeed scholar. He had a very different track than the German track of his father and Walt and some of the others. So that made him rather unique, and he was very much into literature as well, so that the way he looked at scripture was in that way. But clearly, once he arrived, Walt Brueggemann became sort of the shining star among the faculty. Elmer Arndt, who I thought of as the dean, and for whom I wrote my thesis about H. Richard Niebuhr under Arndt, he because Brueggemann was only in his second year, he would come periodically and sit in the back of the room and sort of throw something down, and you would see him making notes. And I thought, I wonder what those conversations are like, because he would have been Walt's theology professor at an earlier time. And then, as I heard in the one of the podcasts that you had with somebody, Lore, Alan and Dottie Miller, who were part of the more reformed piece, had come to the seminary. In that first year, I was a friend of mine who's now deceased, Ken Press, who was from one of the I call them the royal families of the old Enoch Church and the E's. He and I had studied at Elmhurst and at the University of Chicago, and took a deep dive with a professor who later, in his very late years, came to the University of Texas, of Alfred North Whitehead. And so we went in to see Walt one day and had the nerve to say, this already rather arrogant second-year professor, we have a book you might want to read. And he had been so disparaging of anything philosophical and too theologically philosophical. And so I think he was speechless for a moment. And I know he never forgot it, because he said to me on two very different occasions many years later, you remember when you and Press came into my office to tell me what to read? Anyhow, we felt that the whole organismic view was congruent with what we were learning with him about the whole Hebraic notion and the Deuteronomic narrative, and that there may be some reason to look at that. He became more philosophical later, about maybe 15 or so years later, when I went back to Eden as minister in residence, and I had run into Ricoeur in my readings, Houston, and I got to Eden, and I was going to sit in on different classes, and I went to his Psalms course, and I thought, this is all about Paul Ricoeur. Yeah. And so it was fascinating to see what was happening. And I had just listened to Fred Craddock, who had also stepped into the world of Ricoeur. And so my amusement was, well, the guy has finally come around.
But you knew better than to tell him that he ought to be.
I didn't say that. I didn't. Yeah.
So, Frank, you know, you came out of a tradition that had a high view of the scripture. And to what extent did that impact, you know, you said you were tutoring or kind of mentoring these other folks. To what extent was that also part of what you brought to Eden that those from other traditions did not? I mean, I think that's been one of the impressive things for me when I look at the Evangelical Synod's catechism, and when I understand from Walter and Fred Trost and others the importance and value of scripture, the biblical text, taking the biblical text seriously, I assume you also grew up with that tradition with seriousness of that as well.
Yes, the German church I went to was a lectionary, a mostly lectionary church, and the primary pastor during my growing up years was a fellow named George Ellebright, who was very well read and very articulate. And he apologized on the Sunday when he stepped into the pulpit. And it was the beginning of the undoing of his pastorate, I think. And he read from the Christian Century the letter from the Birmingham jail. Wow. And where I sat in that old German church, I've always made more over some of the German art windows in the sanctuaries where I've been, partly because we sat with a huge woman at the well, hovering over us as a family. And my mother had been widowed very early in life, and I was just 12, and then everybody else was younger than I am. But we were regular in that pew. And Jesus and this non-Germanic woman at the well, I think some Orthodox asked me if I had an icon. That's my icon in terms of what that faith was about. And So there was a congruence, plus our family had gone through some traumas over the fact that we had connections, and we frequently had conversations, front porch conversations mostly, uh, with neighborhood Black people instead of ignoring them. And my dad would have probably, he was quite gregarious and not very interested in the church. Uh, he was probably a candidate for the city council because of the number of people who were Black voters in our neighborhood. And instead, he had a heart attack and died. Um, my mother did the March on Polio and invited the Black school that was only half a block from our home, that we had to walk past and walk many more blocks to get to our school in the segregated years. She got to thinking, instead of those of us who are pale-faced going to these Black families, I'm going to go talk to the principal and the PTA there. And so there was good participation. And at the end of the evening, they brought their tin cans with the receipts, and there was hospitality in our home. And several of my mother's lifelong friends bolted the house when they discovered that there were going to be mixed race fellowship. And I'm sure she had taken counsel several times as a young widow with our pastor. And I'm sure that she explored that with him as well. And so I felt very good about what the church was standing for and supporting, both in our family and what I saw and heard. My siblings, who were younger, really didn't pick that up. All they picked up was that our Sunday school teachers were all saying, we can't let those United Church of Christ congregationalists, the two churches in New Orleans were Black churches, come in to our property. So there was a motion made that only people of color were only to be allowed on the property in uniform. In other words, domestic. And it failed. But it was a horrendous argument. And then it was a legal battle, because there were many of us, over 50 of us, that stayed late into the night at this annual meeting when they brought the motion, with people that we rarely had ever seen in our church coming to make sure that it stayed closed to those people. And the issue was, it did not succeed if the youth vote was counted. So the argument had nothing to do with church, but Louisiana law, and whether the Napoleonic Code gave us the ability that the tradition and the church constitution gave us to vote. Maybe not in property matters. Well, one of the early moderators of General Synod was the president of our congregation. And he was shrewd enough to say, after hearing that our pastor was brainwashing people, and then they were beginning to use the word communist as well, not red, but it was the Red Scare time beginning. And he said, I will appoint a committee to discern. And he was fair, but I think he knew a lot of those people that had come out wouldn't be there again. And so those things attached themselves to my passions.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the things that's been so impressive to me about this tradition is the combination of high view of scripture with social justice, human rights, which is just, we've not held those together well anywhere. And so for this tradition to hold those highly together has been so impressive to me. Now, did your family come into New Orleans from Germany and just stay, or did you go up the river and come back, or how did you end up in New Orleans?
My grandfather and his siblings were orphaned aboard ship on the way to the Midwest. They were going to go
Okay.
up the Mississippi to the
Mm.
Ohio and Missouri Valley,
Sure.
because that's where all that
Sure.
settlement was going. But there's a whole community that was very strong in its benevolent institutions in New Orleans. There were 12 of those churches way back. And they were the community that took care of the orphaned and widowed and broken people that couldn't
Mhm.
go north. And New Orleans developed, as it developed, had a stronger German community than has been many times. The famous French bread bakers, the prominent bakers, were Leidenheimer and Binder, and they
Hmm.
brought recipes from Germany.
Interesting.
And they knew something about atmospheric pressure, so they knew how to situate their ovens so that it baked the perfect loaves. Anyhow,
So
that got
did you hear my interview with Roland Russell?
I have not. I have it, but I haven't done it yet.
So
Yeah,
he grew up in New Orleans.
yes, he graduated a couple of years ahead of me from Fort J High School.
Interesting. So as we move towards conclusion, I want to come back to Eden. And one of my tasks in writing Walter Brueggemann's biography, was to uncover what happened around the time of 1978 that allowed this, up between 60, were you there in early 60s, 61,
Yes.
62?
Yes, I was there in 62.
So he came in 61, correct?
He came in 61 and I arrived in 62.
Okay. So between 61 and 78, he wrote half a dozen maybe books. And then he wrote The Prophetic Imagination, and then he wrote 100 books more, something like that. So can you fill in, I tried as best I could to say what was going on that was stirring within Walt in that environment. But can you say anything more about what was happening in the classroom with Walter, for example? That because the prophetic imagination, that work, if you go back to a couple of the other books, like I just referred to Hosea, The Tradition for Crisis, his book on Shalom from 1972, these books are clearly predecessors of the prophetic imagination.
Mhm.
I assume that in the classroom, he was also dealing with some of the issues that would emerge in the prophetic imagination. Can you say anything about what was in the classroom at that time with Walter, or anything you remember from that period that might fill in the gaps?
Parenthetically, there's also the one about the land.
That's right. That's right.
And
Very
it was
important.
important to me because of some of the other things that I was involved.
Yes.
It was so clear that he was just exhaustive in terms of probing all that stuff. One of the things that I found interesting a few years later was that I did not have much memory of his dancing his way through the Psalms until he got in, when I got back there and he was allowing Record to crack open a bunch of that stuff.
Yeah.
But it was very passionate. My one ongoing curiosity about him had to do with the fact that he practiced what in your book perhaps was the quietistic counsel of his mother, in contrast to what you said was more his father's inclination to kind of go overboard about some things that might shake the pews a bit. And two of the big civil rights things that happened that were part of the Eden journey happened right at that time. Karen and I had been married, and we were not able, because she began teaching when the March on Washington took place. Otherwise, we would have gone, not with Eden people, but people that we knew from Elmhurst and other places. And we've always envied that they got to go. But we marched downtown in St. Louis to where the Dred Scott Courthouse is by the river. And I remember saying to Karen, it's very disappointing as I look around. I don't see many Eden people here, students or faculty. Shame on us. And so I had that itch about me. And then we were invited or challenged to send a delegation to experiment with what the student summer in Mississippi was going to be about with voter registration. And I went, and several people said that they made their decision to also go when somebody who grew up in the South was willing to go. And my family, Karen and I wrote a letter to our parents about the fact that I was getting on the train, but I asked her not to mail it until the train had left the station, so that the New Orleans family, her dad was a pastor in another of the big German churches in New Orleans. And so we wouldn't let them know until I was already there. And one of the people that our group worked with was James Chaney, ironically. And it was the spring before the Mississippi burning. And we had gone to a black church for a rally one of the nights we were there. And it was burned to the ground, as were many other black churches that gathered that way. But the faculty who went did not include Walter Brueggemann. And so I remember saying there was some conversation among some in our class about, he's the youngest of these people, and he's letting his older mentors do the going to Mississippi, and it's harder for them. And I shared a bedroom with Lee Wiston, and I said to the students who were a little edgy about it, well, he and Mary are expecting children, and she's pregnant. And I think that might govern why somebody makes that kind of decision. But my observation has been that he always had a little bit of a restraint when others of us hit the streets or registered black voters, when Goldwater was going to be a candidate for president or whatever. And yet a lot of the inspiration were his elaborations of the prophetic texts, which were just phenomenal. Yeah. And I think one of the reasons he didn't land in one of the more prestigious divinity schools, and I was interested in your telling of some of that, was that he has not regarded himself, despite all these books, as of the same ilk as Reverend Childs, some of these. And it was through the Presbyterians that I knew, it was unnerving to me that he didn't go to Princeton, and then he did go to Columbia. But I had a walk at, do you know the Presbyterian Mo Ranch in Texas?
No.
Do you know Ghost Ranch?
Yes.
Okay. Mo Ranch is the Texas Mo Ranch. And the Texas Conference of Churches had regular faith and order conferences every year for years. And I had Walt come to do one of those. But the guy who was the theologian in residence, who had retired from the Presbyterian Church, said, Frank, come take a walk with me. I want to talk to you about something. And I said, what's that? And he said, you know how we borrowed Walt and piggybacked on his being here when you had him here? And I said, yes. uh, he said, well, I have some Walt news for you. And that is, he's leaving Eden. And I said, oh, he said, yes. And we got him. And he was very involved, not only with the alumni, but probably the selection and the arrangements that were getting made. He said, I think he's going to have room to soar. And I never had a chance to talk further with Harrison about that, but he must have been part of the people that cut the deal.
Interesting. Frank, I'm embarrassed. Tell me about Karen. I don't know your wife, and I don't know. I mean, you talk like she's been involved in much of this, and you've been together for a very long time. So, can you introduce us to Karen?
Yes, Karen is a Potter She's the oldest of 7 kids. Her father was a rancher who was quite brilliant and who also went to Elmhurst and Eden. And he went there even though his mother had gone blind during the early teens epidemic, flu epidemic. And as was suggested to me because of my mother's being a widow, he was abandoning his destiny to be a rancher and to take care of his family. And his call was deep, and the people that had helped nurture him and probably surface with him the call admired him as a scholar as well. And so he soared at Elmhurst and at Eden. And then he pastored churches, though they had given him the honor graduate award to go do graduate work. And he chose instead to come to Texas and serve a German-speaking church. And then he then was asked to come to St. Louis to a church where the president, Sam Press, went to church. And he was there, but it was also struggling with how can you be an authentic church in a super suburban setting. And then was called to this church on the streetcar line in New Orleans. And I met Karen in her first weeks there. And my way of telling it is she was we were asked as a group of old Enoch kids who were in several of the churches at the same high school. Do you mind if our new minister's daughter joins us? And we said, of course. And it happened, the seat at the table was next to me. And I say, that's the day I was smitten.
And that was before Eden and Elmhurst or
yes.
high school.
And then I discovered that her dad was a phenomenal text preacher. And somebody, including the son, the journalist's son of H. Richard, while at Tulane and the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, went to church there to hear him. And then he began to have some of the stellar Germans who were traveling, who were in that relationship with the German church or the World Council, preach on occasion. And that was not the church I grew up in. And so it was interesting. And then he really lived the life of a servant leader, because the racial justice stuff and then the peace and justice stuff tried to eat him alive with the kind of ugliness that just exploded about the time I graduated from high school and Karen left. The schools were to be integrated and all that. And so he was a great hero. when I went to Elmer Arndt and said, I want to do a thesis with you, and I don't know if I should do it on the two Niebuhrs or one of them. And he said, well, you don't want to get messed up with, I read the Lydia Osto book,
Yeah.
and it finally made sense to me. He said,
Okay.
Riney is too messed up with all his family stuff. You don't want to get into all that. You don't have time for all that. And you can't do both of them. So do H. Richard. And that fit because of the social sources of denominations and all that.
Yeah, I got it right here on the right here. So you and Karen went off to Elmhurst together.
She was a year later,
Okay.
and we had sort of stopped dating because I kept sending her letters when I was a freshman at Elmhurst, but I sent them to the wrong numbered house where the parsonage was, and she didn't get any of them. And I thought, well, she's had it with me. And then we re-met at Elmhurst and resumed our friendship. And as our grandson speaks of it, courtship.
And did you go on to Eden together, or did you just go to Eden?
No, she had to finish, and I was at Eden, and the Cuban Missile Crisis happened.
Yeah.
And her family assumed that she would do what her mother had done and wait for me to graduate, and then we would get married. But with the Cuban Missile Crisis, we decided we should not be 300 miles apart from one another. And so we moved up the presumed wedding date by a couple of years and got married the summer that she graduated.
Interesting. I got one more question for you. Frank, you've been so tolerant of all my questions, but how have you lived with the tension of a tradition that you grew up in, given what we've described, and the church that you have helped to lead and to form? How have you lived with that, knowing that the church could be more than it is?
Well, two historians complimented me. Maybe that's a way to explain this. And I really sort of didn't get it the first time. The second time I sort of began to recognize it. In both instances, sort of out of the clear blue, I was chairing the Ecumenism Council for the UCC, and there were some natural tension, but we had finally moved beyond, we have to have a balance, not of men and women, but ENRs and Congregationalists. And I had served both kinds of churches. And so this one person said to me, you know, you're kind of our generation's Melanchthon. And I was pleased to see that got mentioned in something, in one part of discussions that you wrote. And then in a very different setting where I literally was ready to say, we need some sort of intervention because things were so heated. And I think it had to do with some rather horrifying tensions that are still bubbling, because I just saw it in the news of the UCC with the Lutheran and Reformed conversations. And the UCC was left off of the motions for the official establishing of full communion in the Lutheran Reformed dialogue. And it was because Avery Post slept and didn't get to breakfast. And the other hotshots, whom I'll leave unnamed, in Europe said, you know, we can do this if we just happen to forget the UCC. And later, it was one of the Lutheran bishops in Texas who was considered utterly Marxist, who got up at their synod and said, there's something not right in this legislation. The Presbyterians had already said yay. The United Church of Christ isn't on this list, and they're very important to us. And so anyway, my then much later, Karen and I, with some others from Kansas, were guests in Germany, and we went to Melanchthon's chapel and house, and some people said, "Are you sick?" I sat down in one of the few pews there, and I just got into sort of a deep sense of reflection. And I don't know if you've been there, but Melanchthon is at the podium, and he has Luther in the back on one corner and Calvin in the back on the other corner. And he's trying to straighten them out about the catechisms, etc. And so I said to my friend when we were walking out, it was just a very soulful moment for me. And I was just in touch. I didn't explain that it had been alleged that I was the Melanchthon of our generation. But anyway, so it just played that way. And I kept saying, when people would say, "How did you prepare for this?" And I said, "This is the only kind of faith life I know." And it is very ecumenical. And it is deeply justice and peace oriented. And I don't think there's any other way to do faith for me.
Frank, I think that's a great last word. I mean, it's been an honor for me to hear your story, to hear more about your experience at Eden with Walt and others. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yes, and thank you, and thank Walt for hanging around and keeping on and keeping on.
I will thank him. I talk to him every Sunday, and we get a week by week play on how Walt's doing, and he's doing pretty well right now. So I'm
That's
so
good.
thankful too. Yeah. I'll tell him you said hi.
Thank you.
All right. Blessings. Thank you.